All right. So here we go. Chapter 18. Why does that say? Oh, it's chapter 17 overview. No, I opened up the wrong one. I don't want 17. My bad. We've already done it. All right. Okay, here we go. So chapter 18, right? Okay, so we have, at this point, we've gotten through the Civil War, right? The Civil War is, as I'm sure y'all recognize, a lasting, sort of has a lasting impact on the United States, right? And so out of this comes sort of first the idea of the lost cause, right? And the lost cause is this overly romanticized ideal of what the South was, right? This cotton growing plantation era where life was simpler, but also there were aspects in terms of like, I mean, it was old school, right? It was very much a period where sort of there were clearly defined social classes. You were really born into whatever class. Like you couldn't. The old South didn't have like new money, right? Like you didn't have this idea of sort of social mobility. And so I think a lot of people, or a lot of Southerners, right, they have that sort of concept of the lost cause, the nostalgia for the era here where, even poor whites were at least a better social class than, slaves or people of that nature. The New South is this idea that that the South is going to emerge from the Civil War sort of redefined. And one of the things that happens with that is sort of the economic growth and the first bits of industrialization within the South. So prior to the Civil War, any factories really that existed in the United States were predominantly up in like the New England area, right? So the New England area is more industrial than our southern states prior to the Civil War. Now we're going to be bringing specifically textile mills down to the South and providing an opportunity for sort of industrialization and industrial growth and the creation of, theoretically the creation of a middle class and things of that nature. That's the sort of idea behind the new South. Redeemers are a group of Democrats, right? That are sort of trying to save the South from Northern influence. Okay, so there's a concept that's probably should be on the PowerPoint here called a carpetbagger, which are people that came down from the North that were looking to looking for economic opportunities in the South, right? So again, following the Civil War, following most wars, actually, there's a significant opportunity for economic growth, especially in an area that's just been devastated by war. And so your carpetbaggers were these Northerners who would come down and try to set up, textile mills or things of that nature, where they're trying to profit off of sort of the new South and what the South is going to be now that slavery is done. And so the redeemers are people that are basically trying to protect Southern tradition and Southern ideology from carpetbaggers. Obviously, it shouldn't surprise you that there's some significant distrust, if not downright hatred, between Northerners and Southerners following the Civil War. There's still a lot of general disregard and general, the feelings are quite negative, especially for the South toward the North. I think the North is a little less, I don't think the North cares as much, you know what I mean? But the North is also obviously victorious in the Civil War. And so Southerners tend to, hate Northerners at this point. And again, part of this is the result of the South having to undergo significant changes, right? You now have a massive labor force that has to be paid because they had been slaves. And then you have Northern money coming down and trying to set up, textile mills or manufacturing or industrialization in order to profit off of, one, this newfound labor source, but two, because the South is sort of in shambles, there's a lot of opportunity for growth at this point. And so what you see here with this economic growth, and obviously the tobacco was still pretty big in Virginia and North Carolina and whatnot around that time. But you do have textile mills that are set up generally with hydroelectric power on rivers. You have steel making. So Birmingham, Alabama, basically becomes the Pittsburgh of the South. But essentially what you have is a significant amount of opportunity. Sharecropping is obviously another significant impact. So sharecropping is basically the replacement for slavery, right? And the way sharecropping works is you had these massive plantation owners who have acres and acres and acres of land. They can't cultivate that land all by themselves, so they have to hire help. And the easiest way to hire help is to basically just give somebody a little bit of land, and then in turn, you take a share of whatever it is that they produced. But ultimately what sharecropping does is really, it becomes a means of economic slavery. So again, the sharecropping system is clearly a failing of the South. And it really is, I refer to sharecropping as economic slavery, because ultimately, like I was saying, what happens is you have the sharecroppers renting out a little bit of land, right? They then grow cotton or rice or whatever it is they're growing. And then they owe a certain amount of that crop to the landowner. And the landowner creates a system where the sharecropper has to be in debt, right? So let's just say, for the sake of argument, You sign a contract that says, you need to have, 20 bushels of cotton, right? Like that's my share. So I'm the old plantation owner, right? You're sharecropping for me. We come up with an agreement that says you have to have, I get 20 bushels of the cotton that you grow on the land that I'm basically renting to you, right? And so you grow 25 bushels of cotton. So I get 20. How much do you get? 5, right? Except then, well, I provided you with the seeds. So you owe me for the seed, right? And I provided you with like some tools because you didn't have any of your own tools. So you got to pay me to rent the tools. And so we create a system where once you add everything in, now you owe me like 30 bushels of cotton. You only grew 25. So I get all of your cotton and you still owe me. So next year, that debt just rolls over. And ultimately what happens in the sharecropping system is you can't leave my farm because you're so grossly in debt to me that you're basically required to stay in order to pay off your debt, which essentially becomes like slavery. All right. Tenant farming is sort of the same, but tenant farming or the crop lien system are also problematic in the sense that if you're talking about tenant farming, you have to grow whatever is profitable, right? Because you're trying to turn a profit on whatever it is that you're growing. And I know y'all have not taken economics, but like basic supply and demand, when supply goes up, the equilibrium price decreases. And so now you're not being capable of making as much. What's up, Coach?
So during this week's, we're gonna have, I got a Zoom before the game.
Okay.
So they're saying that they might just kind of shut it down. Since the 4 people are already solidified, there's no point in us playing Austin and Elkins. Because the point spreads are so wide. That's what they're
You
thinking.
mean Austin and Bush?
Bush, yeah, or whatever, yeah. Like those people, there's no point in those people continuing, considering even if Rich Point did not play the last 4 games, they would still get 4th.
Okay. All right.
So they're thinking about maybe just only playing the games like us, that could be places. That could determine places. Thing is, Delta doesn't have anybody left other than them. So they're not picking up 2 losses. But us and Richmond could still be here for a tie. Technically we're tied right now.
Why?
Because they haven't played Dulles or us again.
So they have 2 losses because they have a loss to Dulles and a loss to us.
Right.
And we have 2 because we got 2 to
Right.
Dulles.
Correct.
All right.
We'll see.
Okay.
It's always something.
Yep. All right. Race relations in the South, obviously, and not just in the South, but in the 1890s are relatively, they're probably what you would expect or what you would think. After Reconstruction ends, right? So Reconstruction ends in 1877, basically. And Reconstruction is where you had, if you remember, that's where you had like Union troops. Like you basically had an occupying army in southern states, right? And that occupying army ensured that, Black people could vote and do things like that. Once the army leaves, your old school racist Southerners who had been in charge of the South up to that point, they sort of regain power and authority. They systematically disenfranchise African Americans again, right? So now Black people don't have the right to vote. They don't have representation. And there's a wide range of ways that they do this. Poll taxes is one of them, literacy tests, the white-only primary, which only allowed white people to vote in a primary, so then you couldn't get black representatives because the white people wouldn't vote for black representatives in the primary, and so then you only had white representatives. But all of that is a means of sort of systemically trying to oppress blacks. And in 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson makes it all the way to the Supreme Court, and it actually establishes the doctrine of separate but equal, right? So Plessy versus Ferguson is what establishes segregation as law. And it means that you can basically you can have a city bus, right? And the white people ride in the front and the black people ride in the back, and they're segregated. And that's okay because everybody's still on the same bus, so we're all equal, right? Or black kids go to a black school and white kids go to a white school, but that's okay because everybody's still getting an education, right? That's the idea behind Plessy versus Ferguson. And it's a fairly widely held belief. Then Jim Crow laws are a series of laws that again are trying to decrease the rights of blacks in the South. They'll do things like require blacks have a job. If they don't have a job, they go to prison. Want to guess what they did in prison? They were contracted out to work farms. Sounds a lot like slavery, doesn't it? Right? I mean, some of the ways that the South tried to reinstitute slavery and tried to maintain the status quo from before the Civil War are pretty substantial. You had a number of issues with race relations, and there are a number of instances that are probably not taught enough in school, but should be. And the Wilmington, North Carolina race riots in 1898 is a really good example. So you essentially have Wilmington, North Carolina is on the coast, right? It is predominantly black, okay? Because believe it or not, a large number of southern cities after slavery ends are actually majority minority cities. Okay, like there I forget the name of the city now, but there was a town in South Carolina that was 90-something% black people because there had been that many slaves in that town prior to that. In North Carolina, you basically have a mob of white supremacists that are trying to end the publication of an African-American newspaper, right? And again, this has its roots in sort of pre-Civil War slavery when black people were not allowed to learn how to read, right? Because educated slaves were far more unruly than uneducated slaves. And so ultimately what happens is that you have in 1898 a couple of thousand whites that basically go on a rampage through Wilmington, burning down and destroying black-owned businesses. And so, I mean, it's nothing short of sort of terrorism in the sense that they're literally murdering, probably 100 or so Black men or women, burning Black businesses to the ground, and basically threatening and scaring anybody into leaving. I mean, you either sort of stayed and shut your mouth and just accepted it, or you left. Ida B. Wells is a pretty significant character that you need to be aware of. So Wells is a Black woman who is very vocal in the late 1800s, arguing for a variety of sort of reforms and changes. She helps found the NAACP. She writes extensively about lynchings, because lynchings were one of those, and hopefully I don't have to explain what a lynching is to you. It's where basically Blacks were either hung or tied up and drugged behind trucks and things like that, or horses. But do you understand why they happened? See, this is one of those things that we learn what the event was, but you don't necessarily learn the root cause of it. And one of the root causes of it was this misconceived, misguided notion of like white women's virtue, right? That Black men are barely better than animals, right? They have no impulse control. And therefore they would just run around just raping white women all the time, right? Like, this is kind of the belief. And this is why you have lynchings of Black men who did nothing other than say hello to a white woman passing them down the street. You know what I mean? Like, ma'am, like literally just extending sort of common courtesy. And so it's very much a sort of psychological tactic that makes it easier for white men to engage in things like this as well, because they're not doing it out of hatred now. They're not doing it because they just want to lynch Black men. They're doing it because they're protecting white women, right? And so concepts of chivalry make that significantly easier for white men to justify lynchings. Wells is also a suffragette, right? So she's also looking at trying to help get women the right to vote, because that's another significant aspect. Booker T. Washington, and I kind of wish that they were on the same slide. During this time, Booker T. Washington and another man named W.E.B. Du Bois are two prominent Black figures that are both working to try to increase sort of Black people's opportunities in life, right? To try to create some sort of equality and opportunity. But they go about it in very, very different ways. So Booker T. Washington is one of those people who believes that economic equality will lead to social equality. Y'all understand what that means? So think about it like this, right? If you are poor, like truly poor, right? And I don't know that any of you probably have ever really even seen this or experienced it. But if you were really truly poor to the sense that you couldn't afford to wash your clothes. You obviously couldn't afford new clothes. So all of your clothes were ragged, and people looked down on you. Okay? They would judge you because it's kind of what people do. It's just human nature. And so Washington believes that if you provide blacks with an economic opportunity, right, to where they could go out and learn trades, like he founds the Tuskegee Institute, which is basically, it's basically like the first HBC, really, right? Like it's like the first school for blacks trying to teach them, trying to teach them skills or trades or things that are going to give them an opportunity to make money. And then once they make money, then they can afford to buy, clothes and a house. And if they can afford to buy clothes and if they can afford a house in the same neighborhood as whites, then ultimately, according to Washington, they're going to have social equality as well, right? Because now if blacks and whites live in the same neighborhood, right, and they have the same clothes and they're eating like the same dinners and they're shopping at the same stores, like that economic equality is going to lead to social equality. Okay, and that's Washington's belief. Du Bois is sort of the opposite. So he believes that you cannot have any equality unless you have social equality first, right? So that economic equality is ultimately secondary, and that you can't actually achieve economic equality unless you have sort of social equality. And I'm not saying, like, I don't know that either one of these guys are 100% right, because I do think there's something to be said for economic equality leading to social equality. But it's also really hard to have economic equality, right, if you have, wage gaps for blacks and whites, right? Like if a black man takes a job, and I don't care what the job is, right, and he gets paid 80 cents, and a white man takes the same job and he gets paid $1, well, you don't have economic equality. And you don't have economic equality because you don't have social equality, because the black man is just valued less, right? And so that's sort of the idea here, or the complexity sort of between the two. The New West. So obviously after the Civil War, one, you had some massive migration of black people that are leaving the South, because why would they stay? But you also have a significant amount of land that still exists in the West, and land is opportunity, right? Again, at this point, we're still sort of yeoman farmers. There's still a lot of sort of self-sustaining farming that's going on. You have people that want that freedom, that opportunity to go out, have their own, 20, 30 acres, whatever it is, that they can plow and plant some stuff. And that with that, they would have some opportunity. The expansion of the West, right, basically leads to, again, these different economic opportunities. You have cattle drives, cattle ranges in the West because they have the land for it. You have all sorts of mining operations. In fact, one of the things that we find is, significant, gold and silver deposits. Obviously, we had the California gold rush in like 1849, prior to the Civil War. But you have post-Civil War gold rushes, like up in the Dakotas, North and South Dakota. You have post-Civil War silver rushes in like Comstock Lode, which I think is Nevada, Tombstone, Arizona. But you have these boom towns, these mining boom towns that sort of pop up immediately, trying to sort of get rich quick, right? And so the West is that draw of opportunity, of a new life, of an ability to significantly increase your own opportunities. Right? Cattle is obviously a significant aspect of the West, although it doesn't last nearly as long as you would think. In 1873, a dude invents something called barbed wire. You know what that is? Do you know why that's significant? Because prior to barbed wire, you basically had farmers that they would have their land, right? And then you would have like cattle ranges in Texas. And then they had what are called cattle drives. This is what actual cowboys did, right? And they would take all of the cattle like north, and specifically they would take it from like Texas up into like Nebraska, Missouri, up into this area, because this was the rail line that you would put the cattle on and take the cattle to Chicago where it would be slaughtered. Okay. So you had to get the cows from Texas to the railroads. And so cowboys would basically herd this cattle north, right? Well, obviously you understand cows are not the smartest animals in the world, yes? And they just kind of walk and do what they want to do. And so as they go through farms in like Kansas and Nebraska before they get to the railroads, they're just wandering through, eating farmers' crops and trampling their fields and all sorts of stuff. So the creation of barbed wire basically fences off large areas, and now cattle drives don't have the free range of motion that they had before, which sort of ends that concept. Okay. Farming in the Midwest specifically, again, the end of the open range is the idea that you don't have just general open fields, right? Farmers are now planning a little bit better and doing things like fencing in fields and crops and things like that so that they have better control over what they're doing. Additionally, you have the rise of commercial farming. There's been some significant technological advancements during the 1800s that provide opportunity for farming to become commercially profitable, right? So things like John Deere, like tractors, are now make it possible to till larger plots of land with less labor, less time, less energy, so you can grow more in order to sell it, which again will ultimately end up creating some problems because we're going to end up with some like supply and demand problems out of that as well. Women on the frontier. So life on the frontier for women was different, obviously, than life in sort of like established cities. But they still faced a lot of the same sort of general prejudices and sort of societal constraints. They couldn't own land. You know, if you had, you became a widow, obviously, because pioneer life and frontier life was difficult. If you became a widow, you may end up in a situation where you've sort of lost everything, and then you wouldn't have an opportunity to maintain your homestead, and then you find yourself homeless, which is obviously wildly problematic. We do have some Indian wars around this time. You probably heard of Custer and his last stand. Yes, maybe, I don't know. But obviously, as we're still trying to is we're still trying to settle the United States. Native Americans, Native American tribes are sort of a thorn in our side. We have to do something about them. And we have to do something about them because we want the land that they're on. And so there's obviously a number of skirmishes, conflicts, all in an attempt to push natives off their land as whites extend further and further. Grant, President Grant, formerly General Grant, his Indian policy is basically that Indians should have an opportunity to assimilate. We actually have something called the Dawes Act that attempts to do that very thing, trying to eradicate Native American culture, and for lack of a better term, whiten them up. But the reality is most Americans don't agree. Most Americans see natives as savages, as incapable of being civilized, and really would just rather sort of see them eradicated. Custer is the one of the more well-known players in the Native American wars, the Indian wars around this time. Up in the Dakota Territory, you had people or whites, Americans, that were searching for gold, and in doing so, they're trying to move Native Americans off this land. And so ultimately, Little Bighorn becomes the last stand is generally what it's referred to. As Custer is moving, he attacks an encampment, which he was outnumbered like 10-1, which is just stupid. Even when you have guns and they have bows and arrows, 10-1 is pretty dumb. And so ultimately, Custer and all of his men are, I mean, I don't want to say they're massacred, because the natives were really just defending themselves. Like, massacred is probably the wrong word to use. But Little Bighorn does change Grant's opinion toward natives and Native American policy. And Grant becomes less peaceful in that regard. Right. Another aspect of the New West that matters. So in the Midwest specifically, you had a large number of Native American tribes that were wildly dependent upon the buffalo for their sort of lifestyle, right? Like, these were Native American tribes that would kill a buffalo. They used the meat, obviously, for food. They used the hide for like clothing, blankets, things like that. They would use the bones to make tools or weapons. There was not a lot of the buffalo that went unutilized, right? But for white people, they didn't really eat buffalo meat. And really what they wanted was like the pelt, the hide, the skin of the buffalo. And then obviously with rifles, they could be far enough away and fire into a herd of buffalo and just drop one, and the rest of buffalo like wouldn't do nothing, right? And so you actually see some instances where they would kill dozens of buffalo and leave like everything but the hide to rot. And so that the loss of the buffalo created the loss of sort of economic opportunity for natives, like their lifestyle then changed as the buffalo went away. And so they didn't really have any choice but to sort of accept, some of the things that we forced upon them, like assimilation and what are they called? I'm losing my mind. Reservations. That's the word. Like Indian reservations, where we forced them onto a small plot of land because they just didn't have their way of lifestyle anymore after the buffalo was gone. The Dawes Severity Act is what I just mentioned a minute ago, and that was actually taking natives out of their, especially the children, out of their tribes, right? And then like sending them to schools, like white schools, and giving them a white name. And then like we would cut their hair, and make them dress like white people, but then you'd send them back to the Native American village afterwards. Like for 10 years, they'd live in a boarding school with white people. And then at the end of that time, they're like 15 or 18 or however old they are. And you send them back to the Native American tribe. And the Native Americans are like, dude, you're not an Indian anymore. Like, you don't know our lifestyle. You don't know our way of life. And so they're basically like ostracized twice because they were forced to assimilate and then sort of abandoned once they had assimilated and sent back to their homes, which in turn limits their sort of acceptance within their own culture. But ultimately, it's at this time that we get to the end of the frontier, right? Like by 1900, there is essentially no more frontier in the United States. Now, Alaska will become another frontier, a new frontier. On some level, Alaska is still a frontier today, but Alaska is not a part of the United States, really. Okay? Like, yes, it's U.S. territory. We've purchased Alaska because we purchased Alaska, I believe, in 1867, maybe, from Russia. But the frontier, not only does the frontier end, but the lack of a frontier drastically changes sort of general American lifestyle. And Turner's frontier thesis, I actually thought about making you read that as one of the, as one of your short responses. It's an argument that by no longer having a frontier and no longer having the opportunity to expand, the mentality and the sort of history of the American Southwest is vastly different. And Turner, on some level, is like the first sort of modern historian that's writing about, sort of the historical impact of some of these things. But ultimately, the lack of those sort of easy opportunities then is going to lead us into some significant issues, right? Farming is actually at this point in time, farming is not nearly as profitable as a variety of other endeavors. It's not like the Great Depression bad, But the mechanization of farming changes the general dynamics, right? Like it's not about, sort of individualism and being self-sustaining and doing things for yourself. It's now about trying to create wealth and create money and opportunity. And so that significant change, again, because they miss out on a lot of the economic growth of the time period. It leads to a populist movement, which we'll talk about later. But that's the end of that, right? So we're done. So you have your quiz tonight.